The auctioneer's gavel came down on a house nobody else wanted, and the moment it did, a 52-year-old billionaire sitting in the back row went completely still. Not because he'd won. Because he'd recognized the address 3 seconds too late to stop bidding. It wasn't the peeling paint that stopped his breathing. It wasn't the crooked porch steps or the boarded windows. It was the number nailed crookedly above the door. A number he hadn't seen in 38 years, but one his body remembered before his mind caught up. He had just bought back the house his mother lost. The house she died in 3 months after losing it. And somewhere inside those rotting walls was a truth that would take his entire empire apart and rebuild it from the foundation up. His name was Marcus Vail. Founder and CEO of Vail Capital Partners, a private equity firm managing $11 billion in assets, specializing in distressed residential debt. And in less than 40 minutes, he was about to walk through the front door of the one property in America he had spent 38 years pretending didn't exist. Marcus Vail's office occupied the 51st floor of a glass tower in downtown Atlanta. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. A desk carved from a single slab of Brazilian rosewood that cost more than most people's houses. Behind him, a wall of framed magazine covers, Forbes, Bloomberg, Fortune, each one featuring the same tailored suit, the same practiced smile, the same headline variation on a theme. The man who turns bad debt into gold. That was his specialty. Buying distressed mortgages, foreclosed properties, tax-delinquent homes for pennies on the dollar, then flipping or renting them at margins that made investors weep with gratitude. $11 billion under management. 14,000 properties across 9 states. A machine so efficient it barely required his daily attention anymore. He was 52 years old, and in 30 years of building that machine, he had never once told anyone at Vail Capital where he came from. Not the interns. Not his COO. Not the reporters who profiled him twice a year and always asked the same question, "What inspired you to get into this business?" and always got the same rehearsed answer. "I saw an opportunity in an inefficient market." That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth started in a small mill town outside Spartanburg, South Carolina, in a 3-bedroom house on Larkspur Lane, where his mother, Eleanor Vail, raised him alone after his father left when Marcus was 6. Eleanor worked the line at a textile plant for 11 years. Double shifts when the overtime was offered, which was often, because the plant was dying slowly and everyone knew it. She came home smelling like machine oil and cotton dust, made dinner out of whatever was cheapest that week, and never once, in Marcus's memory, complained out loud. When Marcus was 14, the plant closed. Eleanor found work cleaning offices at night, then a diner shift in the mornings. She stitched together enough hours to keep the lights on, but the mortgage on the Larkspur Lane house had an adjustable rate that reset in his sophomore year of high school, and when it reset, the payment nearly doubled overnight. She called the bank. She called them more than once. Marcus remembered sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while she stood in the doorway with the phone pressed to her ear, her voice getting smaller with every call, asking if there was any way to restructure, any program, any grace period. There wasn't. Or if there was, nobody at that bank bothered to mention it. The foreclosure notice came in March. The house was gone by August. Eleanor and Marcus moved into a rented duplex 2 towns over, and something in his mother had gone quiet in a way that never came back. She died of a heart attack the following spring. Marcus was 17. The doctor called it cardiac arrest. Marcus, even at 17, understood it as something closer to exhaustion that finally ran out of road. He buried her, finished high school living with an aunt, and walked into college with a single, cold conviction burned into him. Nobody would ever again be able to take something from him because he didn't understand the paperwork. He would learn the system so completely that he would never again be the person begging on the other end of the phone. He just never expected to become the person on the other end of somebody else's call. The auction house was in downtown Spartanburg, a converted brick building 3 blocks from the courthouse. Marcus hadn't planned to attend in person. His acquisitions team handled distressed property auctions across the Southeast every week, usually by phone, occasionally in person for larger portfolios. This one was a routine county tax sale, 41 properties, mostly vacant lots and abandoned rentals nobody had paid taxes on in years. He'd flown down that morning for an unrelated deal in Charlotte and had an afternoon gap in his schedule. His assistant mentioned the auction happening nearby, almost as an afterthought, a place to kill 90 minutes before his flight home. He sat in the back row in a suit that cost more than the combined value of most properties on the docket, half listening, scrolling through emails, letting the auctioneer's rhythm blur into background noise the way it always did. Then the auctioneer read the next lot number and an address. 414 Larkspur Lane. Marcus's thumb stopped moving on his phone screen. He told himself it was a common street name. There were probably a dozen Larkspur Lanes in South Carolina. He told himself that right up until the auctioneer flipped the photo on the display screen behind him, and Marcus was looking at a house he hadn't seen since he was 15 years old. Same crooked porch railing his father had never fixed. Same narrow bay window in the front room where his mother used to sit and mend clothes by lamplight. 38 years of decay layered over a structure that was, unmistakably, unforgivably, his childhood home. His hand went up before his brain gave permission. He didn't remember bidding against anyone. He didn't remember the exact number he said out loud. He remembered the gavel coming down, and the auctioneer calling out, "Sold," to the gentleman in the back, and the sudden, suffocating silence in his own chest as 38 years of carefully constructed distance collapsed in under 60 seconds. He had just paid $18,000 for the house that killed his mother. He didn't tell his assistant to reschedule the flight. He didn't call his COO. He drove the rental car himself, alone, down streets that had changed just enough to feel foreign and stayed just similar enough to feel like walking into a recurring dream. The house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac that used to be a through street before the mill closed and half the neighborhood emptied out. The yard was waist-high weeds. The porch steps sagged in the middle like a smile with no teeth left. Someone had spray-painted a code number on the plywood covering the front window, the mark left by whatever crew had come through to secure the property years ago after it fell into county hands. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a long time before he made himself walk up the path. The front door lock had rusted through. It took one hard shove to open it, and the smell hit him immediately: mildew, dust, decades of trapped air finally disturbed. Sunlight came through gaps in the plywood in thin gray blades, cutting across a living room that still, impossibly, held pieces of the life that used to happen there. A water-damaged armchair. A light fixture hanging by exposed wire. The narrow bay window where his mother used to sit. He walked through room by room like a man defusing something. The kitchen, where the linoleum had curled up at every corner. The narrow hallway. His old bedroom, barely big enough for the twin bed that used to sit against the far wall, the wallpaper peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. And his mother's room, at the end of the hall, where the closet door still hung slightly open the way it always had because the frame had warped years before they ever moved in. He didn't know why he opened that closet. Some instinct older than reason. Inside, beneath a rotted shelf that had collapsed at some point in the last 3 decades, there was a small metal lockbox, rusted at the corners, wedged into a gap between the wall studs where the shelf used to sit, a space no realtor, no county inspector, no cleanup crew had ever thought to check because it wasn't visible unless you were on your knees, in the dark, prying apart debris with your bare hands the way Marcus suddenly found himself doing. The box wasn't locked. The latch had rusted open years ago. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, brittle at the creases, and a smaller envelope with his name written on the front in his mother's handwriting. Marcus. He sat down on the floor of that ruined bedroom, in a suit worth $11,000, and opened a letter his mother had written 38 years ago and never had the chance to give him. The letter was dated 6 weeks before the foreclosure was finalized. 6 weeks before she and Marcus packed what they could carry and left Larkspur Lane for good. "My darling boy," it began. If you're reading this, it means I never found the courage to say it out loud, or I ran out of time before I could. I need you to know something before this house stops being ours, because I think some truths are easier to leave behind than to speak. Marcus's hands were shaking so badly he had to set the paper down twice before he could keep reading. The letter explained something Marcus had never known. Something his mother had carried alone for years and never once let show on her face at the kitchen table, in the doorway with the phone pressed to her ear, in any of the 1,000 ordinary moments he'd watched her endure without complaint. Before Marcus was born, Eleanor had a daughter. His mother had been 19, unmarried, and her own parents, deeply religious, deeply unforgiving, had given her an impossible choice. Give the baby up, or lose her family entirely. She chose to keep the pregnancy, but not the child. She placed her daughter for adoption through a private agency in Greenville, believing, at 19, with no money and no support, that it was the only way to give that child a chance she couldn't provide herself. She never stopped looking for a way back to her. For years, Eleanor had quietly saved whatever she could, a few dollars a week folded into an envelope in that same lockbox, toward hiring someone who could help her find the daughter she'd given up, someone who could tell her whether that little girl had grown up safe, whether she'd want to be found at all. The adjustable-rate mortgage reset the same year Eleanor had finally saved enough to hire a private investigator. She used the money for the mortgage instead. She wrote in the letter that she made that choice without hesitation, because Marcus was the son standing in front of her every single day, and the daughter she'd given away was a hope she could still afford to lose a little longer. I chose you every single time, Marcus, the letter said. But I never stopped wondering about her. Her name, when I held her for the only hour they let me keep her, was Josephine. If I never find the strength to search for her myself, I need you to know she exists. I need someone in this world to keep looking, even after I'm gone. Marcus sat on that floor for nearly an hour before he could stand back up. He had a sister. A sister his mother had spent decades quietly grieving in private while raising him alone, working double shifts, losing her house, losing her health, and never once burdening her son with the weight of a secret that big. Marcus flew home to Atlanta that night, but he didn't go to his office the next morning. For the first time in 19 years, he canceled every meeting on his calendar without explanation and sat alone in his penthouse with the letter spread out on the table in front of him, reading it again and again, searching for details he might have missed the first 4 times. A name. Josephine. A city, Greenville. A private adoption agency called Piedmont Family Services, which, according to a quick search, had closed its doors in the late 90s, its records absorbed into the state's sealed adoption archive. Marcus had spent 30 years learning how to move through bureaucratic systems that were designed to keep ordinary people out. Contract law, foreclosure statutes, county tax codes, the fine print that had once cost his mother her home. He knew exactly how those systems worked, because he had built a career profiting from the gaps inside them. For the first time, he was going to use every ounce of that knowledge for something that had nothing to do with profit. He hired the best adoption search investigator in the Southeast, a woman named Renata Ellison who specialized in cases involving sealed pre-1990s records, closed agencies, and the kind of dead ends that had made most families give up decades ago. He told her only what mattered, a name, a birth year he calculated from the letter's timeline, a city, and the fact that money was not a factor. Then he did something he hadn't done in 19 years of running Vail Capital. He asked his COO to pull the acquisition history for every property his firm had purchased out of foreclosure in the past decade. Renata's search took 11 weeks. Marcus checked in every few days, and every few days, the answer was the same. Sealed records. A closed agency with archives scattered across 2 state systems. A trail that had gone cold before Marcus was even out of college. While he waited, he did something that surprised even himself. He started reading his own company's foreclosure files. Not the summary reports his analysts prepared for investor calls, not the aggregated performance metrics that made Vail Capital look like a machine humming along at perfect efficiency. The actual case files. Individual borrowers. Individual addresses. Individual stories buried under acquisition codes and portfolio numbers. He pulled a sample of 400 files from the past 3 years and read through them one by one on his rosewood desk, late into the night, the way he had once read through his mother's foreclosure notice as a 15-year-old boy who didn't understand yet what it meant. The patterns made him physically sick. 61% of the foreclosures Vail Capital had acquired involved an adjustable-rate loan that reset within 18 months of default. The exact mechanism that had taken his mother's house. 44% of the borrowers had contacted their loan servicer at least 3 times in the 90 days before foreclosure, requesting a modification, a forbearance plan, anything. The servicing logs showed most of those calls were never escalated past a first-tier representative reading from a script. Nobody with actual authority to help ever heard those requests. And Vail Capital's own acquisition strategy specifically targeted properties in the earliest stage of foreclosure, buying the debt at its steepest discount before a modification could even be finalized, because a completed foreclosure was worth more to the fund than a saved mortgage. His firm hadn't just profited from a broken system. His firm had built an entire strategy around making sure it stayed broken, because broken was where the margins lived. Marcus sat at his desk at 2 a.m. with his mother's letter next to a stack of case files bearing his own company's letterhead, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water down his spine, that Vail Capital had spent a decade doing to other families exactly what a bank once did to his. Renata called on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Marcus picked up before the first ring finished. "I found her," Renata said. Josephine Marsh, 49 years old, living in Anderson, South Carolina, roughly 40 minutes from the house where she was born and never remembered living in. She had been raised by an adoptive family who'd given her a stable, loving childhood, according to the records Renata had pieced together, though the adoptive parents had both passed away within the last decade. Josephine currently worked as a hospice aide. She had 2 adult children of her own. And according to public records Renata had cross-referenced almost by accident, she was 3 weeks away from losing her own house to foreclosure. Marcus felt the floor tilt beneath him. An adjustable-rate refinance she'd taken out 4 years earlier to cover medical bills from her late husband's cancer treatment had reset the year before, the payment climbing past what her hospice aide's salary could cover. She'd called her servicer 6 times over the past 4 months requesting a modification. Every call ended the same way his mother's calls had ended 38 years earlier. Polite. Apologetic. Absolutely no help. Marcus asked Renata to send him the servicer's name. It was Vail Capital. His own company was 3 weeks away from foreclosing on the house belonging to the sister his mother had spent her whole life quietly grieving. The daughter she'd chosen not to search for so she could keep a roof over Marcus's head. And now Marcus's empire, built in part on the very mechanism that took that roof away from his mother, was about to take a roof away from the daughter she'd never stopped loving from a distance. He didn't call Josephine that day. He didn't know yet how to explain any of it out loud. Instead, he called his COO and gave an order that made the man go silent on the other end of the line for a full 10 seconds. Freeze every foreclosure in the active pipeline. All 9 states. Effective immediately. No exceptions. His COO, a careful, methodical woman named Priya Anand who had helped build Vail Capital from its earliest days, pushed back the way Marcus expected her to. "That's 1,100 active files, Marcus. Investors are going to want an explanation." "Then give them one," Marcus said. "Tell them I found something in our acquisition strategy that needs to be corrected before we move another file forward." He spent the next 3 days doing something he had never once done in 19 years of running the firm. He read every single case in the active pipeline, one by one, cross-referencing servicer call logs against foreclosure timelines the way he had done with his sample files, except this time he wasn't looking for patterns. He was looking for names. For families. For the specific moment in each file where a phone call for help had been logged, then ignored, then escalated straight into legal proceedings because a completed foreclosure paid better than a modified loan. Of the 1,100 files, 312 showed the same pattern Josephine's case did. Multiple documented requests for help. Zero escalation. A resettable loan structure that had been specifically flagged by Vail Capital's acquisition algorithm as high probability for full foreclosure, which was treated internally as a selling point, not a warning sign. Marcus had spent 30 years building a machine that identified families most likely to lose everything and then made sure they did, because their desperation was the most profitable part of the portfolio. He called Josephine on a Thursday evening. Not as Vail Capital's CEO. Not with a script. He introduced himself simply as someone connected to a woman named Eleanor Vail, and asked if he could come see her. Josephine Marsh answered her own front door in Anderson, South Carolina, wearing hospice scrubs, exhaustion written into the lines around her eyes the specific way it settles into people who've spent years taking care of everyone except themselves. She didn't recognize Marcus's face from any magazine cover. She had no reason to. He stood on her porch and told her the truth in the plainest words he had. That her birth mother's name was Eleanor Vail. That Eleanor had given her up at 19 under circumstances she never chose and never stopped regretting. That Eleanor had a son, Marcus, who was standing in front of her now, 38 years after finding a letter hidden in the walls of a house neither of them had lived in for decades. Josephine didn't cry right away. She stood very still in her doorway, the way someone does when a piece of information is too large to process standing up, and finally said the only thing that seemed to matter to her in that moment. Is she still alive? My mother? Marcus had to tell her no. That Eleanor had died the spring after losing the Larkspur Lane house, when Marcus was 17, decades before Josephine ever had the chance to know she existed. Josephine sat down on her own porch steps and wept for a mother she had never met, for the version of her own history she'd spent 49 years without, and Marcus sat down beside her, a stranger and a brother in the same breath, and let her cry without trying to fix it, because for the first time in his adult life, he understood that some things weren't his to fix quickly. Only to sit beside. When she finally spoke again, her voice was raw. She told him about the foreclosure notice sitting on her kitchen counter. 3 weeks left. 6 phone calls to her servicer, all of them going nowhere. A house she'd raised her own children in, about to be taken by a company whose name she recognized now only because Marcus had just said it out loud sitting on her steps. I work for the company that's about to take your house, Marcus said quietly. I built it. He didn't offer to simply forgive her debt on the spot. He knew, even in that raw moment, that a single gesture wouldn't undo what his firm had done to 312 families currently sitting in that pipeline, or the thousands more scattered across a decade of acquisitions before that. What he did instead took the next 4 months to build. He restructured Josephine's loan personally, outside the standard servicing process, converting it to a fixed rate she could actually afford on a hospice aide salary, and he made sure the same offer applied automatically to every other file in the frozen pipeline that showed a documented, ignored request for help. 312 families received a call from an actual person within Vail Capital, for the first time in the history of their case, asking what they actually needed to stay in their homes. He didn't stop there. He ordered a full audit of the acquisition algorithm that had flagged high foreclosure probability properties as a selling point, and had it rebuilt from scratch with a single new rule layered over every other metric. No property could be acquired for full foreclosure if the borrower had made 3 or more documented requests for modification that were never escalated past first contact. Those files would be automatically routed to a newly created loss mitigation team instead, staffed with people whose entire job was calling borrowers back and actually listening. He created a fund, seeded initially with $40 million of his own money, dedicated to buying distressed mortgages specifically to modify and stabilize them rather than foreclose, aimed at the exact structural gap that had taken his mother's house, adjustable rate resets hitting families in the exact window where a phone call, made by a person who actually had authority to help, could have changed everything. He named the fund the Larkspur Initiative. 6 months after that first call, Marcus stood in the gutted, half-renovated living room of 414 Larkspur Lane, the house he'd bought by accident at a county auction for $18,000, watching a construction crew tear out water-damaged drywall and expose the original bones of the house underneath. He wasn't rebuilding it as a home. He was turning it into something else. A small community office for the Larkspur Initiative's regional loss mitigation team, based in the same town where the mill had once employed half the neighborhood, serving the same kind of families his mother had once been. Josephine had agreed to run it. She stood beside him in that gutted living room, in the same bay window where Eleanor used to sit and mend clothes by lamplight, and looked at the exposed studs and the fresh sunlight pouring through windows that finally had glass in them again. "I keep thinking about her sitting right here," Josephine said quietly. "Worrying about a daughter she never got to raise, while trying to keep a roof over the son she did." "She never stopped thinking about you," Marcus said. "Even when she couldn't do anything about it. She just chose the fight in front of her." Josephine reached into her bag and pulled out a folded copy of Eleanor's letter, the one Marcus had given her the day they met, now soft at the creases from being read more times than either of them could count. "She said she needed someone in this world to keep looking," Josephine said. "Even after she was gone." "Well," Marcus said, looking around at the exposed walls of the only home his mother ever truly loved. "We found each other. Late. But we found each other. I want to be honest with you for a moment before we finish. This story is fictional. Marcus Vale and Josephine Marsh are not real people. I created them, along with Vale Capital, the letter, and the house on Larkspur Lane. None of it happened exactly the way I've described it. But the mechanism behind this story is very real, and it's still happening right now, in homes across the country. Adjustable-rate mortgages reset every single day in America, and the moment they do, monthly payments can jump by hundreds of dollars overnight. Research from housing policy groups has repeatedly shown that borrowers who contact their loan servicer early, before default, are far less likely to actually receive meaningful help than most people assume, because first contact representatives are frequently limited to scripted responses with no authority to modify a loan. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has documented, through years of servicer complaint data, that a significant share of foreclosure cases involve borrowers who attempted contact multiple times before losing their homes, and that breakdowns in communication and escalation are among the most common reasons modification requests never move forward. Distressed mortgage funds, similar in structure to the fictional Vale Capital, do exist, and some genuinely do specialize in acquiring properties in early-stage foreclosure, where the discount is steepest specifically because a completed foreclosure is often more profitable than a modified, stabilized loan. That tension between profit and preservation is not fiction. It is a structural feature of how distressed debt markets are frequently built. And the emotional core of this story, a parent quietly sacrificing one hope to protect another, a family fractured by decisions made under financial desperation, is something housing counselors and adoption search professionals both encounter more often than most of us realize. If you or someone you know is facing a mortgage reset, a loan modification denial, or the early stages of foreclosure, contact a HUD-approved housing counselor. It's a free, federally supported service, and you can find one through the Department of Housing and Urban Development's website. Ask specifically about loss mitigation options before a foreclosure filing begins, because the earlier a real conversation happens, the more options usually exist. If this story affected you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Not for the algorithm. Because somewhere out there, someone is standing in a doorway with a phone pressed to their ear, asking for help, and hoping someone on the other end is finally listening. Thank you for staying until the end.